Osama Bin Laden. On the 2nd of May 2011, American helicopters crossed into Abbottabad, Pakistan, and headed for a walled compound at the end of a dirt road. Osama bin Laden was inside. He was the founder and leader of al-Qaeda, the organization behind the September 11th attacks. The compound had stood out for years. It had high walls, security gates, very few outward-facing windows, and no visible phone or internet lines. The people inside burned their trash instead of putting it outside. On the upper floor, a balcony had an extra privacy wall. It looked less like a home and more like a sealed box. Then the helicopters came in low. One lost lift inside the compound and had to be abandoned. But the raid continued. American forces breached the buildings, climbed floor by floor, and pushed toward the upper level where bin Laden had been living. Less than an hour after the raid began, he was dead. The team gathered hard drives, computers, and documents, destroyed the damaged helicopter, and left. A man who had hidden behind couriers, walls, and secrecy for years was finally found in one house, on one floor, in one short night. Anders Behring Bravik. On the 22nd of July 2011, a car bomb exploded in Oslo's government quarter. Less than 2 hours later, a man dressed as a police officer arrived on the island of Utøya. That man was Anders Behring Breivik. He was not part of al-Qaeda or ISIS. He was a far-right extremist and a lone terrorist driven by white supremacist and anti-immigration ideology. The first attack ripped through central Oslo. Smoke filled the streets, glass and debris covered the road. Then the violence shifted to Utøya, where teenagers were attending a political summer camp. Breivik crossed to the island and began shooting. People ran into the woods, hid behind rocks, locked themselves inside buildings, or jumped into the water and tried to swim away. Many were hunted down before help arrived. In total, 77 people were killed across the two attacks. He did not die that day. He surrendered to police on Utøya, was convicted, and remains in prison in Norway. No raid ended his story. No missile struck his hideout. His attack ended with handcuffs, interrogations, courtrooms, and a prison cell he still occupies. Bakr al Baghdadi. On the 27th of October 2019, American helicopters flew into northwestern Syria and headed for an isolated compound near Barisha. Bakr al Baghdadi was inside. He was the leader of ISIS, the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, and one of the most wanted men in the world. By then, the so-called caliphate he had once ruled had largely collapsed, but Baghdadi himself had not been found. The raid began at night. American forces approached the compound knowing the main entrance was likely booby-trapped. Instead of using the front door, they blasted holes through the walls and entered from the sides. Rotor wash hammered the ground. Floodlights cut through the dark. Troops pushed inward while Baghdadi fled. He ran into a tunnel beneath the compound with children as U.S. forces and a military dog closed in behind him. The tunnel narrowed. The path ended in a dead end. There, Baghdadi detonated a suicide vest and killed himself. That is the image that defines his end. Not a leader standing with fighters, not a commander making a final speech, just a tunnel, a dead end, and the collapse of the last place he tried to hide. Timothy McVeigh. On the 19th of April, 1995, a Ryder rental truck pulled up outside the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building in Oklahoma City. Minutes later, it exploded. Timothy McVeigh was responsible. He was not part of a foreign terrorist organization. He came out of the anti-government far-right extremist scene in the United States and carried out what was then the deadliest terrorist attack on American soil before September 11th. The bomb was made from ammonium nitrate fertilizer and fuel oil. When it detonated, the front of the building was ripped open. Floors collapsed. Concrete and glass crashed into the street. Rescue workers moved through dust, twisted steel, and broken walls searching for survivors. 168 people were killed, including 19 children. McVeigh did not die in a raid or a shootout. He was arrested, tried, convicted, and sentenced to death. On the 11th of June 2001, he was executed by lethal injection at the federal prison in Terre Haute, Indiana. That contrast makes his story stand out. The attack came in one huge blast in broad daylight. His own end came years later in silence, inside a prison chamber, strapped to a gurney, with witnesses behind glass. Khaled Sheikh Mohammed. On the 1st of March 2003, Pakistani security forces and U.S. personnel raided a house in Rawalpindi. Inside was Khaled Sheikh Mohammed. He was a senior al-Qaeda planner and is widely described as the operational mastermind of the September 11th attacks. Unlike bin Laden, he was not the public face of the organization. He was the planner behind routes, logistics, timing, and structure. His capture did not happen in a famous helicopter raid. It happened in one targeted operation in Pakistan after years of intelligence work. Armed men entered the house, secured the rooms, and took him alive. One of the most important men in al-Qaeda was suddenly no longer moving between countries and safe houses. He was in custody. He did not die. He was transferred into U.S. custody and remains held at Guantanamo Bay, where the legal battle over the September 11th case is still unresolved more than 2 decades later. His story moves from that raid in Rawalpindi to cells, hearings, delays, and one of the longest terrorism prosecutions in modern history. Ted Kazinski. In April of 1996, federal agents surrounded a small wooden cabin outside Lincoln, Montana. Inside was Ted Kazinski. He was not part of al-Qaeda, ISIS, or any organized terror group. He was the Unabomber, a lone anti-technology terrorist whose bombing campaign lasted 17 years. His targets included academics, airlines, and business figures tied, in his mind, to modern industrial society. The cabin looked primitive. One room, rough wooden walls, a narrow bed, tools, bomb parts, journals, and drafts of the manifesto that helped expose him after his writing was recognized by his brother. The man who had terrified the country through hidden mail bombs was living alone in a shack in the woods. Kazinski did not die during the arrest. He pleaded guilty, spent the rest of his life in federal custody, and died on the 10th of June, 2023, at a federal medical center in North Carolina. His story has 2 endings. First, the cabin in the forest where agents stepped into the isolated world he had built. Then, decades later, a prison medical unit far from the wilderness that had defined his image. Ayman AlZawahiri. On the 31st of July, 2022, Ayman AlZawahiri stepped onto a balcony in Kabul. He was the leader of al-Qaeda after bin Laden's death and one of the organization's main ideologues for decades. By then, he was no longer hiding in mountain camps. He was living in a safe house in the Afghan capital, in a neighborhood U.S. intelligence had been watching closely. Officials later said they had built a pattern around the house and noticed that Zawahiri regularly appeared on that balcony. After years of hiding, one small routine in the open made him vulnerable. The setting was almost ordinary. Morning light, a residential street, curtains behind glass, then one man stepping outside. The strike that killed him was precise. U.S. missiles hit the balcony area without leveling the rest of the building. That makes his final scene very different from others in this video. No large raid, no troops entering a compound, no long exchange of gunfire. Just one balcony, one man, and a strike aimed at that exact spot. Zawahiri had spent decades shaping al-Qaeda's ideology. His own final moment came in stillness, high above a quiet street in Kabul. Ramzi Yousef. On the 26th of February, 1993, a truck bomb exploded beneath the North Tower of the World Trade Center in New York. Ramzi Yousef was the mastermind behind it. He was part of the wider jihadist militant network that fed into later international terror plots, and he was closely tied to Khaled Sheikh Mohammed. Yousef's goal was even bigger than the attack itself. He wanted one tower to collapse into the other. That did not happen, but the blast still killed 6 people, injured more than 1,000, and filled stairwells with smoke as office workers tried to escape in darkness. The bombing became an early warning of the kind of symbolic mass casualty terrorism that would define the next decade. Yousef did not die. He fled the United States and later became involved in the Bojinka plot, a plan to blow up multiple airliners over the Pacific. On the 7th of February 1995, he was captured in Islamabad, extradited to the United States, convicted, and sentenced to life in prison. So his story ends not with an explosion or a firefight, but with reinforced doors and permanent confinement. The man who wanted to bring down the towers is still alive, but the rest of his life is being spent behind bars. Musab al Zarqawi. On the 7th of June 2006, Musab al Zarqawi was inside a safe house near Bakr, Iraq. He was the leader of al-Qaeda in Iraq, the branch that later evolved into the movement that gave rise to ISIS. Zarqawi had become notorious during the Iraq War for sectarian attacks, bombings, and filmed killings. That evening, intelligence led coalition forces to one plain house outside the city. It was not a fortress. It was not a bunker. Just a small building in open terrain. 2 American F-16 jets were sent in. Once the target was confirmed, they dropped precision bombs on the house. The strike tore the building apart. Walls collapsed. The roof came down. Dust and debris rose over the site as troops moved in. According to the U.S. military account, Zarqawi survived the blast only briefly. He was pulled from the ruins and died soon afterward. That gives the scene an unusual final beat. After years of evading capture, One of the most feared men in Iraq did not die in a moving convoy or a bunker siege. He died beside the shattered remains of a small countryside house, under the smoke of a strike that finally found him. Carlos the Jackal. In the 1970s and 80s, the name Carlos the Jackal became one of the most famous names in international terrorism. His real name was Ilich Ramirez Sanchez. He was not part of al-Qaeda or ISIS. He came out of the left-wing revolutionary and Palestinian militant scene and later ran his own network, the Organization of the Armed Arab Struggle. His story belongs here because he represents an older kind of terrorist notoriety, not online propaganda, not modern jihadist videos, hijackings, hostage crises, forged identities, secret apartments, and armed operations moving across capitals. He became globally known after a series of high-profile attacks, especially the seizure of an OPEC meeting in Vienna in 1975. For years, he seemed to move across borders as if he could not be pinned down. Carlos did not die in combat. In 1994, French operatives captured him in Sudan and flew him to France. He was convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment, and he remains in prison. That makes him a fitting final chapter. No drone, no tunnel, no compound raid. Just the slow collapse of a legend built over decades. Not every notorious terrorist ends in an explosion. Some simply disappear into custody and stay there. If you liked this video, hit subscribe for more like it, and let me know in the comments what you want to see next.